All right, so this evening we're going to be talking about forage recovery and establishment. So even though it's February of 2024, as we're looking into spring and upcoming summer for our warm season perennials, a lot of folks are already asking questions or seeking information on how to manage their warm season perennials as we recover from drought conditions in 2023, as well as some high fertilizer prices the past couple of years, and potentially some poor management decisions during those times. And so a lot of questions about how to recover and whether or not some of those fields might need to be reestablished. So we're going to talk about that this evening. And so first and foremost, as we look at recovery or reestablishment, the first place to start is always with a soil test. I'm sure many of you have heard this in previous presentations from myself or other forage specialists or soil scientists, but soil testing really is where we should start when it comes to making management decisions for our pastures or hay meadows. So obtaining good soil samples are going to be a critical component of that. So if we're sending good representations of our property to the soils lab in College Station, they're going to give us the best information and the best recommendations based on our specific production system and our goals. So we want to make sure we're taking a good composite sample that's a combination of 12 to 15 cores of each management area. So a management area is a uniform field or a part of a field that's no larger than about 50 acres that is a given forage species or possibly a mix of forage species, and that's quite all right, but that area is being utilized for a specific purpose. So a hay meadow is one management area versus a pasture would be a different management area. In a pasture system, we're recycling those nutrients. Our livestock only keep about 10 to 30% of the nutrients they ingest, and the other 70 to 90 are going back into that pasture through their feces and urine. So in a pasture system, we have some continual recycling of those nutrients, which is great. So we don't necessarily need to sample them on a yearly basis. I do recommend every 3 to 5 years. If you're noticing any shifts or decline in production or thinning of a stand, or maybe you have some areas, some bald spots, it's a common question. Definitely soil test those areas. If you do have some bald spots or some areas that are not as productive as other parts of that pasture system, it's a good idea to send samples of both the poor producing areas as well as the better producing areas, so you can kind of do a comparison. Even though you may fertilize an entire field the same, but that gives you a better representation of what's potentially causing some of those issues in those poor producing areas. In a hay meadow, I recommend collecting samples on an annual basis, so every year. And that's because we're really making big shifts in our nutrients in that soil environment. Because we're harvesting a majority of those nutrients in those bales of hay. We're potentially feeding them to our livestock in another part of our property, or we're selling that hay to someone. So we're not recycling any of those nutrients back in that hay meadow. Now, you may have a system where you occasionally harvest and you graze, or it's a pasture that you occasionally harvest when there's excess, and that's fine. Still recommend, every 3 to 5 years in a true pasture or in a pasture system. So you're going to collect those 12 to 15 cores, mix those in a clean plastic bucket so you don't have any contamination, and then send a composite sample or 1 pint of soil to the soils lab in College Station. And so you want to make sure you have a good representation of that management area, because obviously you're going to be fertilizing that entire hay meadow or that pasture the same based on that soil analysis. So this is a great representation of a soil report, kind of condensed, so it fits on the slide. That gives us just a routine soil analysis that provides our soil pH, our primary nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, secondary nutrients, and then any specific recommendations such as a liming application or recommendation, and if we need to split any of those applications on those nutrients based on the total fertilizer recommendation. So a lot of people get overwhelmed with a soil analysis because the results are given in units. The units for the results are given in parts per million. And I don't know about you, but whenever I think about fertilizer and making recommendations, it's in pounds per acre, not parts per million. So a lot of people get caught up in that, or confused, or have a hard time understanding. And so it's a very easy conversion. You can take parts per million and multiply that by 2, and that will give you pounds per acre. So in this particular example, 21 parts per million of nitrate nitrogen, that is plant readily available nitrogen, is equal to 42 pounds per acre. So that's how much nitrogen is plant readily available within that forage system. So you can see there's additional nitrogen recommendations. And since this is a hay meadow, additional nitrogen is recommended between hay cuttings in order to optimize yield for those additional hay harvests. And we'll talk about some of the specific recommendations, especially around potassium, as we talk about these individual primary nutrients and why they are important for forage recovery as we move forward. And so, like I said, we're going to focus on those primary nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So we look at how much is actually needed to produce 1 ton of coastal Bermuda grass. We need 50 pounds of actual nitrogen, 14 pounds of phosphorus, and 42 pounds of potassium. So one thing I want to point out is that we need almost as much potassium as we do nitrogen to produce 2,000 pounds of Bermuda grass. And unfortunately, when we've had high fertilizer prices, 2 years ago, potassium was well over $900 a ton. And so a lot of folks just didn't apply potassium. That was a great way to save some money. And a lot of us really focus on nitrogen when it comes to fertilizing because we know that nitrogen has a direct impact on the yield of our grasses. And so this is a great representation of how nitrogen directly impacts yield for Bermuda grass. It has a very linear relationship, meaning that as we increase nitrogen applications or rate of nitrogen applications, our yield coincides with that increase and also increases. So as we apply nitrogen, we increase our yield, as long as nothing else is limiting, such as rainfall or other nutrients. And so that's really important to understand. Even if you're applying nitrogen, if you have deficiencies in other nutrients such as phosphorus or potassium, you're not going to see the total benefit from that nitrogen. So as we'll see later, balanced nutrition is really critical, not only for optimum production, but also for persistence. Nitrogen will also impact crude protein content of our grasses or our forages. And that can become critical when we're trying to produce a high quality hay to meet the needs of our livestock. Our other nutrients, phosphorus and potassium, do not directly impact nutritive value, but they will impact overall production and persistence as well. So a few things I want to mention about nitrogen. As we move into 2024 and not really knowing what our weather's going to be like for the summer, but it's important to understand that nitrogen is a very mobile nutrient. So it moves through our environment very easily. It can escape into our atmosphere as a gas through volatilization, especially if we have humidity, which is heat, along with moisture, which is very common in Texas and in East Texas, especially during the summer. We have a lot of humidity. So that can increase volatilization or loss of that nitrogen as a gas into the environment. We can also have leaching, so where nitrogen moves through our soil profile away from that root zone from those forages, especially in soils, very sandy soils where water moves very quickly through, as well as if we are applying high rates of nitrogen. So that's why on a soil analysis and recommendations from someone like myself is to split nitrogen applications to help reduce that loss either from leaching, denitrification, or even volatilization. Now, our nitrogen sources can impact that risk of volatilization. Urea as a nitrogen source is highly volatile because it has to go through a chemical process to break down to become nitrate nitrogen. That creates an opportunity for nitrogen to escape as a gas into our environment through volatilization. So I always recommend utilizing urea when we do have greater chances for moisture. That can be during the spring on our warm season perennials, during the fall on those warm season perennials towards the end of the season, or during the winter on our cool season forages such as ryegrass or small grains. It's a great time to take advantage of potentially a cheaper source of nitrogen in urea. During the hot, dry, potentially drought conditions of the summer, I would recommend ammonium nitrate as our nitrogen source. It's not volatile at all, and it will actually sit there and wait for rainfall. A lot of folks last year during 2023 drought would call me with, minimal chances of rainfall, and wanting an additional hay cutting and not wanting to miss that opportunity for some forage production if rainfall did occur. So really skeptical and hesitant to apply nitrogen, but really wanting that forage production. So for those folks, I told them, if you decide to apply nitrogen, if that's what you decide to take that risk, I think it's worth taking a risk with something like ammonium nitrate because it will sit there and wait for rainfall. So if you don't get that rain that's predicted in the next week, then it'll sit there and wait, as opposed to if they had used urea, they could lose some of that nitrogen to volatilization. And many of those folks were glad that they did that. They applied some ammonium nitrate. They got some rainfall that led to an additional hay harvest. So our nitrogen sources can we need to be mindful of selecting a nitrogen source that will work given our environmental conditions. And so ammonium nitrate is a great option during the drought or dry conditions that we have in Texas in the middle of the summer. Our second primary nutrient, phosphorus. As we look at recovery and if we're looking at establishment, phosphorus is critical. Phosphorus is important for root growth and development. Now, we don't necessarily need a lot of phosphorus for Bermuda grass production or typically any of our grasses or any forages. However, it is important for root growth and development. And during high fertilizer price times, there were times phosphorus was extremely expensive, and that was another nutrient that was easy to cut out of our fertilizer applications during that time. But if we're wanting to improve recovery of our warm season perennials, or if we are having to reestablish, start with that soil test, look at your phosphorus levels, and keep in mind that phosphorus is important for root growth and development. So as our plants are trying to recover from drought, obviously root growth and development is a critical part of that process, along with producing above ground leaf material. And of course, for establishment, as seedlings germinate or as sprigs start to take hold, root growth and development will be critical. And so we want to make sure we have enough phosphorus to promote that for those stands as we move into 2024. Potassium, I like to say potassium is for persistence. And in my experience in the 15 years that I've been in East Texas, majority of the time when we have seen a decrease in stands of Bermuda grass or a thinning of a stand, there may be other factors that have influenced that, but one of the primary factors that have led to those poor stands is a potassium deficiency. It's unfortunately for us in East Texas with very sandy soils, that sand has a very low cation exchange capacity, meaning that it does not hold on to positively charged cations such as potassium very well. So sand is naturally infertile, unfortunately, because of that low cation exchange capacity. So our sandy soils tend to be deficient in potassium. And if you remember, we need 42 pounds of potassium to produce a ton of Bermuda grass. So almost as much potassium as we do nitrogen. So potassium is important for water use efficiency. Obviously, with good water use efficiency, that can improve drought hardiness. Potassium is important for disease resistance as well as cold hardiness. Now, so far this year, we haven't had an extremely hard winter or extremely cold winter. We've had some spells, but nothing too concerning. But in previous years when we've had some sub-zero temperatures or some late freezes, potassium deficiencies could make it really difficult for those warm season perennials to continue to persist. So we always want to make sure that we have adequate potassium on those Bermuda grass stands. And unfortunately, Bermuda grass can be a luxury consumer of potassium. So very quickly, if we go back to that soil analysis that we originally looked at, If you look at the small print for potassium, it says split apply potassium fertilizer if recommendation is for more than 75 pounds of K2O per acre. In this particular situation, it's 120 pounds per acre is the recommendation. So we recommend splitting that because Bermuda grass can be a luxury consumer, meaning if this particular producer followed the recommendation and put out the 120 pounds at the beginning of the season and didn't apply any additional potassium, by the end of the season, they would actually have a deficiency. And so that is because that Bermuda grass would use all of that potassium early in the season. So if you have a recommendation for more than 75 pounds, it is critical that you split that application. I also recommend if you're in hay production, when you are making additional nitrogen applications between those hay cuttings, I recommend that you add additional potassium just to help alleviate or prevent some of those deficiencies in potassium and really maintain or improve the persistence of that warm season perennial. So this was a great illustration, a project at the Overton Center looking at how a deficiency in potassium impacts a coastal Bermuda grass stand. So our plot on the left had nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium applied, and that's a season long, or those rates were over a season. So that was split across multiple applications, not a single application. And then on the right, that plot had the same amount of nitrogen and phosphorus applied, but they didn't apply any potassium. So you can see that even in a single season, you really see a difference in those stands of Bermuda grass. No matter what the weather conditions were, whether there was adequate rainfall or even drought conditions, you can see that Bermuda grass is thinning as you look through those weeds. You can see some exposed thatch, so it's starting to thin. And obviously you have some weed competition because that Bermuda grass is not very competitive when it's been weakened from nutrient deficiencies. And so that can occur very quickly, and that can also occur over time, depending on your management style or how that property was previously managed prior to your ownership or your impact. So balanced nutrition is critical moving forward, following soil test recommendations, especially in regards to phosphorus and potassium, to promote persistence, root growth, and development of those forages as we try to recover from drought, as well as we try to persist through whatever the season of 2024 might hold for us. Soil pH can also be a critical component of recovery and persistence of our forages. Keep in mind that forage species and varieties can be very different in regards to their pH tolerance or their pH preference. So this is a kind of a general table showing a critical level of soil pH at 5.8 with that blue line. So as we drop below that, we can see that nutrient recovery and percentage decreases as our soils become more acidic or having a low soil pH, well below 7 or definitely below that 5.8. So our forage species and varieties can be very specific. So it's important to understand, given your forage species, what's the preferred soil pH, because we want to make sure when we're making these fertilizer or lime applications that we're having an economic impact, especially when prices are high or resources are not as readily available as they might have once been. There have been some challenges in East Texas for lime sources or lime availability or cost of lime. So that has impacted a lot of folks in regards to their ability to purchase or use lime, or they've had to make some difficult choices around that. So if you have questions about your forage species or variety and how sensitive it may or may not be to soil pH, reach out to me. I'm happy to have some discussions and we can look at the potential economic impact. Things like legumes, cool season legumes are going to be very sensitive to soil pH. Most of those prefer soil pH of at least 6. So it can require a lot of lime for us in East Texas to be able to maintain a stand of a legume, which can be very popular for winter forages, as well as the ability to recycle some nitrogen. So if you have any questions about soil pH or lime recommendations, please reach out to me. I'm happy to have some of those discussions and advise you or help you make some economic decisions. So of course, as if fertilizer prices are high, we start to look at some alternative sources, and there are some good, bad, and ugly options. Animal manures can be an excellent option. They can be an economical option to provide nutrients, depending on our proximity to the source as well as the quality of that source. So this shows us the average on the outside of the parentheses and then the range of those nutrient values in pounds per ton of a particular manure product. Poultry litter is very popular, very common in parts of East Texas or Central Texas, depending on your location. So that could be an excellent opportunity. 2 years ago, when fertilizer prices were extremely high, and a lot of folks were looking for alternatives, I did have a producer that did an economic comparison and a breakdown of what commercial fertilizer was going to cost compared to poultry litter in her area and what she was getting for her dollar. And she actually found that buying commercial fertilizer at that time was actually more economical than purchasing poultry litter. Ultimately, she was potentially paying for high levels of phosphorus that she didn't need for her level of production or based on her soil analysis. So there can be a multitude of reasons why an alternative may or may not necessarily be a good opportunity. So it will really depend. So there's a question in the chat about where does equine manure rank? I would say it's fairly similar to somewhere in between beef and dairy as far as those nutrients. I'll be happy to look more specifically and share that information with you, Glenn, if you're interested in. Do keep in mind, with any animal manure, even equine manure, it can be highly variable from animal to animal, farm to farm. Obviously, their diet will greatly impact the nutrient availability, but I'm happy to look into that. If you'd like more specific ranges or averages on that. I know some folks have asked about something like rabbit manure, which is very popular for a smaller landowner for gardens or flower beds. As far as rabbit manure on a larger scale, it most likely becomes very uneconomical because it's such small values and so it would take a large volume of rabbit manure to impact a pasture or hay meadow. But for a smaller area, such as a garden or a flower bed, it can be an excellent option. There are also a lot of non-traditional products that become available on the market and are highly promoted by retailers. A lot of them, I just recommend that we're cautious and we look for more information beyond what the salesman is giving us. It's important to evaluate what you're actually getting within that product as far as how much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, or if you're getting any primary or secondary nutrients or not, and then what's the rate of application, or what would the rate of application have to be in order to meet your soil test analysis. So Dr. John Jennings at the University of Arkansas has done some comparisons of traditional fertilizers to non-traditional on Bermuda grass. And he did combinations because many of these products, if you read their label, they're actually meant to be used in combination with traditional nutrient sources and not necessarily as a standalone product. But unfortunately, many of us, a lot of folks tend to see them or want for them to be, or have a desire for them to be a standalone product. But in this particular comparison, those non-traditional products, when used by themselves, did not achieve or did not produce any more forage compared to doing absolutely nothing. So if you come across some of those non-traditional products, reach out to someone like myself. I'm happy to kind of deep dive if I'm not familiar with that product and answer some questions that you might have as to what you're actually getting and how it could or could not meet your soil test recommendations. So another question that came up in the chat is, what about using nitrogen stabilizer? There's one called Amvol on urea. So there are some products that can serve as either urease inhibitors various products that can help reduce the volatilization of urea. Once it's been applied, there are a lot of different products that are out on the market. I'm not personally familiar with Amval. I'm happy to look into that. A lot of those stabilizer or urease inhibitors can be very effective. I would have to look into exactly how Amval works. There are some that are urease inhibitors that work very effectively. There have been some other options that are such as now I'm drawing a blank. I know there was one product, I'm not remembering the name, that was not very effective at reducing volatilization, did not have an impact on reducing volatilization. There's some other products that work in different ways that are still very effective. Nutrisphere, that is correct. That's the one. Thank you, Trent. So I'll be happy to look into Amval. Majority of those anymore do work very effectively and have become much more economical than they were when they originally came out on the market. So those can be an excellent option to help reduce some of that volatilization. All right, so moving on, something else that, along with nutrient management or fertilizer considerations, another aspect of recovery is going to be grazing management. So grazing management impacts our forage production systems greatly, and unfortunately, we can't do anything about how we have managed those forage systems previously, but we can, as we learn how grazing management impacts those stands and their persistence, we can make the appropriate choices as we move forward. So this is a great illustration of how stubble height or leaf area above the soil surface reflects our root structure below the soil surface. And so it's important to understand that we need leaves to reproduce roots, and we also need roots to produce leaves. And as we remove leaf material within a grazing system, in order for that plant to produce new leaves so it can continue to photosynthesize, it pulls from that root structure. So part of that root structure ultimately dies because that plant is trying to produce new leaves. If we're in a heavily grazed scenario and that those leaves are continually removed and they're not allowed to actually grow and to develop, then it's hard for those plants to ever rebuild that root structure. So you're constantly reducing that root structure, not allowing for regrowth and development of not only leaves, but also root structure. So Dr. Jason Banta, our beef cattle specialist, did a great job of taking this visual and applying it to real scenarios in Texas. And so we're going to start on the very far left, so the extremely overgrazed situation. So as we all can see that this is heavily grazed, very little forage production within the pasture inside that fence. And so, very little, if any, roots are left in this particular pasture. Great opportunity for some soil erosion. As you can see, there's some weed pressure that is starting to fill in or has filled in parts of that area. If you look on our side of the fence, you can see there's quite a bit of grass in that ditch, in that roadside area. So this is obviously a direct impact, has been greatly impacted by overgrazing in this particular situation. So it's greatly reduced not only what we see above the soil surface, but what we're going to see below the soil surface. And as far as recovery, this particular scenario, once they received rainfall or as they continue to receive rainfall, what's going to respond first is going to be any annual seeds for weeds such as goat weeds or other undesirable vegetation, because there's very little roots to actually capture any moisture from any of the perennial forages. And then there's obviously very little leaf area. So recovery is next to none in this particular situation. This would be a situation where most likely they would need to reestablish completely and start from ground zero. Moving to a bit better scenario, we have a little bit more forage, more leaf area. Obviously, you can see it's still very short. So not, In an ideal situation, we have some weed pressure. You can see there in the background with the yellow flowers on that hill, and maybe even some thinning in areas. You can see some brown in parts of that field where it's already starting to show some stress of being overgrazed. If you continue to have good growing conditions and maintain nutrients with fertilization, this could easily be recovered, along with you'd also likely need some herbicides, some means of weed control to reduce some of that competition. So it would take some management to help recover this particular pasture. And likely you would also, in part of that recovery, you would need to potentially reduce that stocking rate to allow an opportunity for that forage system to rest so that it can rebuild not only what we see above the soil surface and that leaf material, but also to rebuild that root structure. This is a much better scenario where we have quite a bit of forage. There may be a few weeds there in the foreground, but not anything to necessarily panic about or really fret about. So we have good forage production, and likely as a result, we have a good deep root system. And you can see there's been substantial forage production to the point that they've been able to harvest some hay. So I'm definitely one of those people that's, better safe than sorry. So I always recommend and say that it's easier to deal with excess forage as opposed to trying to manage or trying to find additional forage. And as we know, when we are in a drought and everybody is looking for hay, the quality of hay diminishes. It's in a drought, obviously our hay production diminishes. So we're looking at, we're at higher risk of buying hay or having to buy hay from outside of the state with a lot of unknowns in regards to quality or potential toxins. And everybody else is looking for hay at that time as well. So it becomes very expensive. So I always err on the side of caution and suggest and recommend that it's always easier to manage excess forage as opposed to having to try to find additional forage. This scenario, this particular pasture system is set to continue to persist through drought conditions or beyond drought conditions or any other challenges that might exist in this particular environment. This is our picture on the far right, where we have quite a bit of forage, potentially some excess. You can see there's some what I refer to as roughs and lawns, some areas that have been grazed down a little bit shorter, as opposed to areas where we have a little bit taller forage. Depending on current weather conditions and long-term plans, in this particular situation, the stocking rate could be increased depending on, like I said, long-term weather conditions and plans, or that additional forage could be harvested for hay and saved for later drought conditions or for winter feeding. And as you can see, not necessarily a lot of weeds, or I rarely see any weeds actually in this particular situation. And that is because when our warm season perennials are managed appropriately with nutrients and they are not overgrazed, they're actually very competitive against weeds. So those are warm season perennials, Bermuda grass and Bahia grass, do create quite a competition against weeds if they are managed appropriately. So that can really help to reduce some of our need for weed management if we're maintaining and really promoting that desired forage. And that's actually a means of weed control in regards to a cultural practice of promoting that desired forage that can reduce our need for other weed management. And so speaking of weeds, like I said, promoting our desired forages is step one of trying to reduce that weed competition. So that means maintaining soil fertility and the appropriate stocking rate or grazing pressure so that we're not overgrazing those grasses to the point where we've opened up that canopy and created an opportunity for undesired species to take advantage of moisture or sunlight and start to compete against that desired forage. Other means of weed control, mowing or shredding. This is something and can be our only tool that we have during establishment for weed control. And we'll talk about that here shortly as we talk about establishment of some warm season perennials. And then, of course, with use of herbicides, as always, make sure you are following those label directions and reading the label since the label is the law. So some research from Dr. David Beatty and Paul Baumann, some previous extension specialists with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension in College Station, did an evaluation of forage response to weed control and fertilization methods over 2 years. The first year was a dry year, and the second year they had some moisture. And this is a great illustration of how the combination of both fertilization and weed control can optimize our forage production. So our blue bars are an early herbicide application with and without fertilization. Their green bars are a late herbicide application with and without fertilization. The yellow bars are shredding with and without fertilization. And then the first red bar is only fertilizer without any means of weed control. And then the far right red bar that says control means no fertilization or no means of weed control. So as you can see, for the combination of fertilization and herbicide, a timely herbicide application optimizes our forage production even during drought conditions. And of course, we see a more dramatic impact with rainfall. Obviously, our optimized yield increases fourfold in this particular situation, because obviously rainfall can limit our forage production, even if we're following all other best management practices. But so it's a combination of fertilization and reducing that competition, that optimizes our forage production. So a common question with these graphs is, what's the difference between an early herbicide application and a late herbicide application? So it's greatly going to depend on the target weeds. In this particular study, they were targeting warm season annual weeds. So things like goat weed, annual broom weed, maybe even some annual grasses. So any warm season annual that needs to be controlled when it is small and growing. So it's less than about 3 to 4 inches in height. So an early herbicide application increases our success of control, helps reduce the rate of application that we might need to make. Whereas if we applied a herbicide later, we may still control that vegetation, but it may take a more expensive product or a higher rate of that product. And then having a delayed application gives that weed some opportunity or some time to actually compete against those warm season perennials. Timing of herbicide application always depends on the weed that your target weed that you're trying to control. So anytime you have any questions about a specific weed, timing for herbicide application, I'm always happy to answer those questions, as well as your county extension agents can be excellent resources as well. So other pests that we need to be mindful of are going to include our forage insect pests. And I know there's a presentation on our YouTube channel that goes into more depth on our forage insect pests, including the fall armyworm, grasshoppers, and then the Bermuda grass stem maggot. These pests can also greatly influence our forage production systems. And if our systems are already weakened from drought or lack of nutrients, these pests can do much more substantial damage and really have a greater impact on our forage systems and can delay recovery or can lead to having to completely reestablish our stands. And so for this evening's presentation, I did want to talk about establishment. So deciding whether or not you need to reestablish is going to depend on the percentage of the stand that remains. Obviously, if you have less than 50% of a stand, it likely will warrant needing to replant to reestablish. A lot of folks, often because of the time and the expense it takes to replant, ask about, can I add additional seed or sprigs to my existing stand? And that can be an option. You do have to be mindful that a lot of people, I've had questions about, well, I have a stand of coastal or Tipton 85 Bermuda grass. Can I just throw out some Bermuda grass seed? And will that, no matter what the variety is, and will that coastal or Tipton 85 take over that seeded variety? And that that is not something that we can rely on. So if you have a stand of coastal Bermuda grass and you would like for it to remain a stand of coastal Bermuda grass, then it either needs to be reestablished completely, depending on how severe of a loss of stand you have, or you need to add additional sprigs of coastal Bermuda grass. Mixing anything else into that stand will ultimately result in a mixed stand. So we do need to keep that in mind. Now, in a pasture system, that you might be perfectly happy with that. That might be fine. Still provides the forage that you need for your livestock, but it's something to keep in mind, especially if you are trying to produce a very specific hay product. But that can be an option to help, boost those stands or kind of fill in those dead zones or those blank spots. But prior to planting any type of material, whether it's seed or sprigs, we still need to start with that soil test to determine if there are some deficiencies that need to be amended before we actually plant anything else. Planting new sprigs or seeds into a poor fertility scenario, they're not going to survive. They're not going to be successful. So we want to make sure we're set up for success. And so as we look at establishment, land preparation will be critical to help reduce competition. So I actually recommend if you're looking at a total reestablishment that you actually start in the fall by killing all existing vegetation with high rates of glyphosate, 5 to 6 quarts per acre, creating a well-prepared seed bed, and instead of letting that land lay fallow all winter, you can use that for a cool season annual, such as ryegrass or small grain or a combination thereof. Graze, utilize that forage during the winter and the spring. Come back in the spring, April or May, depending on our weather. Kill all existing vegetation again with another application of glyphosate, and then you're prepared to plant, whether that's by seed or with sprigs, and prepared to create that well-prepared seed bed. During land preparation, that's a great opportunity to add any lime that you might need, depending on soil test recommendations, as well as any phosphorus or potassium that you might need. And remember, for that new stand, phosphorus is going to be very critical for that root growth and development. So we want to make sure we're following those soil test recommendations. So anytime we are selecting species and variety for our forage systems, we need to make sure that they are adapted to our location. They are adapted to the drainage of our soils, whether it's well drained or poorly drained. And they're also going to fit within our production system as far as what our overall goals are, whether it's hay production or grazing or a combination thereof. Or if we're just trying to maintain vegetative cover to reduce soil erosion. It's going to depend on our particular goals or personal goals. So hybrid Bermuda grass is very popular and very common in Central and East Texas. They have to be established vegetatively. They do not produce viable seed. They still may produce seed heads, but they do not produce viable seed that can be harvested and planted from seed. They are not native to the state of Texas. They are very tropical forages. They are well adapted to our environment, high heat. They are drought tolerant if managed appropriately. But our hybrids, those would include Coastal, Tipton 85, Jigs Bermuda grass, Tipton 44, Alicia, Russell. They have to be established by vegetative material. Coastal Bermuda grass can be established by dormant sprigs. So those would have to be harvested during the dormant season and then planted kind of during that time. And that's the only hybrid that's recommended with dormant sprigs. Now, I personally, once again, that safer than sorry personality, I would rather plant green material where we sprigs with green tops. So we have some roots, some rhizomes, as well as green leaf material. And those can be planted in the spring through until we have, until after our last freeze and up until about August. Now, springtime is much better when we have greater chances of moisture. The later we delay that planting, we run the risk of drought and potential failure of establishment. And then tops or green stems, I only recommend this with Jigs Bermuda grass. Now, Jigs is very specific. It is in regards to adaptability. It prefers poorly drained locations. So those creek bottoms or areas that hold more moisture in the soil or that are prone to flooding, jigs is much better adapted to those environments as opposed to Tifton 85 or coastal Bermuda grass. So I do have a list of spriggers or folks in Central and East Texas that sell sprigs or would also plant. So if you do have interest in that, I'm happy to share that information with you. There's a publication on Forage Facts that gives you step by step on how to establish hybrid Bermuda grass, whether it's Tifton 85 or coastal. And these are some pictures from sprigging of Tifton 85 in South Georgia. So very similar environment to East Texas, sandy loam, sandy soils, where Bermuda grass really thrives in that environment. And so here's a picture of those sprigs. They're kind of, some of them are only every 3 feet apart. They're kind of, scattered. You can increase that bushel per acre rate if you want more sprigs within a square foot or in a square yard. And some folks will do that just to help as an extra assurance, but that can also be an extra expense. Weed control during establishment of our hybrids, those sprigs. We do have a pre-emergent diuron that is labeled for newly sprigged Bermuda grass. So it's only labeled for vegetative plantings. So it's not labeled for any seeded varieties. So that is very important to understand. And it has a very short window. That herbicide pre-emergent needs to be applied within 2 to 3 days of sprigging. So very quick application. This is a pre-emergent that's not labeled for well-established stands. So please make sure you are aware of that and follow those label directions. It has great activity on annual grasses, something that's very common in East Texas during sprigging or planting. We can often get some crabgrass, especially if we have some good moisture, that will pop up. Anytime we have some soil disturbance, those warm season annuals, grasses like crabgrass or goatweed, are going to respond to that activity. So weed control can be a challenge during establishment. There are some herbicides that we can use during that establishment phase on our hybrids, and there's a publication on Forage Facts that gives those the specifics in regards to timing and the rate of those products that can be safely used on those new sprigs. So we do have some herbicide options, but most of those are going to work primarily on broadleaf weeds. So if you have any other grasses that come up, they can be spot sprayed with Roundup, which has no soil activity, or they could be mowed, just kind of clipped to reduce any vertical height that could create some canopy shading on those sprigs. Or depending on if it's a highly palatable weed, such as, something like crabgrass or Johnson grass that could be grazed by livestock, you could kind of do some flash grazing. So short periods of allowing cattle to graze those grasses. If you leave them on there too long, they can start pulling up sprigs. So it is a very short controlled grazing event to try to reduce some of that competition. We can also establish Bermuda grass by seed. There are seeded varieties, a lot of different seeded varieties and blends of seeds that can be used to establish Bermuda grass. Seeded Bermuda grass is best used for grazing. It often doesn't produce the vertical heights that we're looking for or that we see in our hybrids for hay production. Bermuda grass seed typically comes in a sack. It's about half hulled, half unhulled. So your rate of germination, not all of your seeds are going to germinate at the same time. So they will germinate throughout that season. You'll have some that will germinate fairly quickly from planting and others that are going to germinate later in the season. Coated versus uncoated, the coating is to protect the seed from any type of fungus or disease. And the one thing to understand is that coating adds additional weight, so that will shift your seeding rate. So always make sure for that particular seed that you're following the seeding rate, because that will be based on whether there's a coating or not. Once again, a well-prepared seed bed. Bermuda grass seed is very small, so it does not need to be planted very deep. So it can be a little bit easier to establish something that we can plant on our own. So advantages or disadvantages to hybrids versus seeded. We do have a few more options for weed control during that first year during establishment on those sprigs. They're generally higher in yielding, and because of their more vertical production and growth, they're better or often recommended for hay production. As far as cost associated with sprigging or seeding Bermuda grass, it will depend on, you know, your sprigger, the distance they're having to travel, as well as the cost of seed. All of our Bermuda grass seed comes out of California, so their weather influences seed availability, which then influences cost. So it can vary from year to year as in regards to what might be more expensive or what might be more economical. So seeding, it is an advantage. It's something that most of us could likely do ourselves without having to purchase additional equipment or hire someone. Often stand establishment may be faster because we will tend to have more seed within a square foot as opposed to sprigs. But once again, you could increase that sprigging rate to help expedite that stand establishment. One disadvantage to seeding is we really have no herbicides that we can use during that establishment season for any weed or competition control. We could spot spray with some glyphosate if we have patches or areas that weeds are a little bit more dominant compared to any seedlings. But it's a little bit trickier, more difficult to control weed competition in a newly seeded versus a newly sprigged stand. For those of you that might be interested in other warm season perennials, such as Bahia grass, it is a viable forage in Central and East Texas. It is also an introduced forage, so it's not native to the state of Texas, can be established by seed. There are some newer varieties such as Tiff Quick that germinate a little bit faster. That is a disadvantage to seeding Bahia grass. Some of the older varieties they just do not germinate very quickly. We do not have a lot of herbicide options. We can use 2,4-D in a newly seeded stand of Bahia grass. When that Bahia grass is 4 to 5 inches tall for some broadleaf weed control. But any grassy weeds, we're looking at spot treatments with glyphosate or mowing or flash grazing potentially. So those are, just some quick notes on establishment. Whether or not you reestablish or add additional seed will greatly depend on the percentage of your stand. I definitely think if you have less than 50%, you definitely most likely are looking at having to reestablish entirely potentially. So it will really depend, but no matter what your choice or how you move forward, always start with that soil analysis to help with recovery, to make sure you have adequate nutrients to help with recovery, or to also, help with establishment of any new seeds or new sprigs. And as we move into 2024, following those soil test recommendations, if you need some recommendations or to talk through that process with someone, reach out to your local county extension agent or someone like myself. I'm happy to answer any questions. And then make sure as we move into 2024, not really sure what the weather's going to hold for us. But manage your grazing appropriately so we're not overgrazing those stands to the point where we're looking at having to reestablish in the future. Keep in mind, it's easier to manage excess forage than it is to find extra forage, especially when a lot of other folks can be in a similar situation as you are. And pest control, even if we're following all other best management practices, pest control will still continue to be a part of our overall forage management plan. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions.